Well, I'm here with John Sheridan, commonly known as Shero, and this year became a 40-year member of the Cruising Yacht Club, so it's a long association with the club. But Shero, a lot of people think that you grew up and started sailing in Victoria, but that's not the case, is it? Just tell us how you got involved in the sailing and where you were born and brought up.
Right, I was born here in Sydney, over in Gladesville, and moved around a bit, and after school I started an apprenticeship at Cockatoo Island, Cockatoo Docks, fitting and turning, marine engineering, and for a few extra dollars through friends, actually some friends that my sister introduced me to. I used to do a few odd jobs down in Mossman Bay, a few repair jobs and help people, and through that I got introduced to Peter Luke, who had Wayfarer.
And he was, of course, one of the founding fathers of the Cruising Yacht Club.
Exactly.
And of the Sydney Hobart race. So
that's
carry on
right.
with how you
and
went sailing with Peter.
He was living on his yacht in Mossman Bay, and of course Jackaroo was just further up the bay with Maris, and so I eventually got invited out to do a bit of sailing with Peter, and just social stuff, no racing. And then I had a bit of a bingle in the car around that stage, and was needed a bit of a holiday for a while. And Peter asked me, he said, "We're going for a cruise up the coast. Would you like to come for a cruise?" And I said, "Would I ever, you know?" And we had a month away and camping up and mooring in Port Stephens, and after a bit of a blow we went into Newcastle at one stage and pulled up the police wharf and did a couple of minor repairs. I tore the mainsail a little bit by not letting a reef point go, so I was a very naughty boy. I had to sew it up. And they, the mob and the police wharf there were very hospitable and very keen to a shandy on a hot day every now and then, and yes, it was. But the whole thing was a marvellous experience for me, and I that cruise away, and I realised that I really loved being at sea. I really enjoyed it.
And what sort of guy was Peter? I mean, we've read a lot about him, and he's an indelible part of the club now. What sort of guy was he?
He was a great old fellow. He was a person who was truly in love with his boat, sailing, yachting, the sea. He was obsessed with it, and he did a lot of work with young people. He took out school groups and sea scouts at different times up in Port Stephens and that sail training. He only stopped because there was a few political problems there somewhere along the line there, and with the club actually too. But anyway. But he was a very gentle man, and was always happy to teach, and was constantly giving little bits of advice to people who were on the boat with him. He was a lovely old gentleman.
Yeah, and of course Jackaroo, another sort of founding father here.
Yes,
I guess
Jack.
They both enjoyed a cold drink on a hot day.
They didn't care whether it was cold or warm. They just enjoyed it, and I must admit. I had a few myself, even at the young age. As a matter of fact, I can always remember going home once to my mother with a bright red face, and she said, "Oh, John," she said, "you've got to look after your skin. You're terribly sunburnt." And, "Yes, Mum, but I think it was half a flagon, half a flagon of sherry that I had inside me when I went home that was making bright."
And let's talk about Wayfarer. I mean, I believe the boat's is in restoration at the moment for our classic yacht regatta later in the year. But what was she like in those days?
She was a great old boat, but It was very sparely rigged out. Everything was old. The safety lines and that were all galvanised pipe, and it was a typical example of boats that were built in those times when the Hobart started. They were all put together on a shoestring, and Wayfarer hadn't been upgraded all that much. Yeah.
There was a rumour that went around that Peter was rather frugal, and when the boat was slipped in the early days, sandpaper was not the sandpaper that we know it today to rub the anti-fouling down. Any truth in that story?
Yeah, that's dead set the truth. Sandpaper was an expense that could be done without, and we used bits of Hessian bag and sand, wet sand, and that was the medium for rubbing the hull back before she was anti-fouled.
Well, that's a great story. And John, the Wayfarer, and I guess I think still holds the record for the slowest trip to Hobart, doesn't it? In the first race, I mean, she got to Hobart in
11 days.
11 days.
That's correct. Yes, yeah.
Wow, yeah, he wasn't in a hurry, that's for sure.
Yeah. I don't know which yacht, the crew went ashore to see if they could shoot some rabbits to get a bit of extra food.
I think she spent a night in Port Arthur, and he wasn't in a hurry.
No, there was no hurry at all.
But Shero, then you, I think, after, or some time after that, you went to Victoria, and that's where a lot of people think you came from. What happened? How did you get down there?
Well, I was transferred with my company at the time down to Victoria, and I was in, at that stage, sales engineering in construction equipment. And very soon after getting down there, I met John Jarrett. Jet Jarrett, as he was nicknamed. Lovely, lovely bloke. And he invited me, when we discussed sailing, and he knew I liked it. He invited me to go out sailing with them, and then if I was prepared to work on the boat a bit on weekends, he'd let me do the Hobart with him, which was very enticing. So, and that started a wonderful friendship with John and his family, who I still keep in touch with. So we did a couple of Hobarts on Athena, and we did a few miles in those days, because sailing to Sydney from Melbourne, then doing the Hobart, and then sailing back to Melbourne again, you needed a month.
But it's interesting you say that. I mean, in those days, and even probably through the 60s and 70s, that the crew were expected to work on the boats. Not to earn their passage, but there was all part of the camaraderie and the teamwork, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah. That's correct. Yeah. There's if you did your share of work, you were assured of sticking with the crew when the Hobart time came around.
So your first Hobart was 64 on Athena, with a few characters on board from Victoria.
Great characters. Yeah, that Warren Neal, of course, that I've kept in touch with all my life ever since, and Bernie Case, Haroldite. Very hard to get off the hill, but yes, people like that. They were really great fellows,
and they made the race. Those sort of people, didn't they? I mean, there were characters throughout the fleet, but they'd stay in Hobart for a long time. They'd have a drink, a party, another drink, another party, but they were always around year after year. I mean,
that's right.
Terrific camaraderie, and as you say, friends for life.
Yes, and then the friendship chain through the sailing in Victoria just grew to encompass all those wonderful people like Russ Evans, and who sailed with Louis. And the Warners, of course.
Yes.
The Warner family with the Churchills, Ken Caldicott, the old Caldy, was sailing down there with them. All those families were interlinked, and John Jarrett was close to them, so I got an intro. Yeah. Kevin Mooney, who had Phantom, was one of his boats. Phantom of Brighton.
But then I think a couple of years later, you mentioned Bernie Case before, one of Victorian's finest yachtsmen. He had his own little boat that you went to Hobart on, I think. Is that right?
Yes, that's...
And there was a bit of a background story to that about the mast, wasn't there? Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Was that Serifa? No.
That's...
Was that the boat, Serifa? What was
Serifa.
Serifa.
That was the Case family boat. And then Bernie got her into shape for the coming Hobart. I think that was 66 or 67. And the episode with the mast was we did the A&A weekend race down at Geelong, which is still happens today. And got about 80 mile an hour wind come across from Werribee there and knocked the fleet flat. And so the mast split on Serifa, so we took it back to Williamstown.
A timber mast, yeah.
Timber mast. And we cleaned her up and gave her a bandage with fiberglass strapping and fiberglass. And put her back in again and sailed up to Sydney, then did the Hobart, and full credit to Bernie putting it together as a young man like that for a sixth overall, I think, which was...
I think at the time was probably the best placed Victorian in the history of the race at that time, or close to it, I think.
Yeah, could well have been, yes. Yeah.
And then Bob Ross, who we know, the club know well, a journalist, he gave you a bit of publicity, didn't he?
He did a bit of an article on it, which I thought he was having a go at us, but in fact he wasn't. He was paying us a compliment that we had accomplished a pretty good deal in doing how we did.
With a bandage mast.
Yes.
Yeah. And then after that, where did you go after the 60s?
Well, I still was doing my sailing down there. I did another Hobart with a yacht called Serena. That was a steel yacht that Jefferson Jones, who was past Commodore of Sandringham, and the rest of the sailing for a while was there. And then I got transferred across to Western Australia, and I sailed over there with a few of the oldies over there. One of the boats was the Starlight of Perth, I think was McAllister's boat.
Neil McAllister, yeah.
Neil
Starfire
McAllister,
of Perth,
right.
yeah, lovely boat.
Young Scotty was just a young guy in those days.
Yeah.
Had a lot of fun with those people over there. Was sad to go actually from Victoria because I'd met so many really good friends, and they were those other characters like Winger Nelson and Alec Black, and all those people that fitted in.
Did just interrupting there, John Jarrett? He built Banjo Patterson, is that right?
He built both. He built Athena in his workshop in about 14 weeks.
So she was steel? Steel, right.
Just a little chine boat.
Yeah.
And in fact, we beat Lou Abrahams in Odin, which was another steel boat, but it was a steel Freya.
Steel Freya, exactly. Yeah.
And we beat her on handicap in one of the Queenscliff to Sydney races because it was pretty wild, and the only time that Athena would go when there was a lot of wind. That's how she got hammered.
Because that's right, because a lot of the Victorian boats to get to Sydney for the Hobart race, they raced Queenscliff, which is the Heads,
Sydney, right, that's right.
Port Phillip Heads to Sydney.
Yes.
That was a race, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
But did you race on Banjo Patterson?
Yes.
To Hobart or?
Yes, I did a couple of Hobarts on Banjo Patterson, and I did a Westabout race on
West Coaster.
West Coaster on Banjo as well.
She was a big solid boat.
She was a beautiful boat, it had a beautiful motion at sea. It just felt just right, like a yacht should feel. It went up and down. But and very well engineered. John Jarrett was a great engineer, very clever man.
So after Perth, where did life take you after that?
So then I was over in Perth for a while, and then I was offered a position to go up and start a train hire company in Singapore.
That's right.
So I did that, and so I was very busy then in about 14 years. I had 2 goes at Singapore, and so I did very little sailing up there. A little bit with another character again, Peter Cantwell, who finished up building police car.
We'll get to him in a moment, but if I could just take you back to the late 60s, that there was an annual race that used to be held out of the CYCA to Jervis Bay, and it used to finish at the Royal Naval College at Jervis Bay. It was a lovely race. And for some reason it stopped. Have you got any idea why that race might have been cancelled?
I've got a feeling...
You've got to tell the truth here,
I was sailing with on Bacchus with another bunch of quiet yachtsmen that got a little bit rowdy after a drink or two. And I think maybe they found our activities down there were just a little bit over the top.
Well, you could name some of those rogues. I mean, you were right in the mix. I know that. But there was Schofield and... Yeah,
Schofield was there, and of course Caldecott sailed with us that year too. He's not a help when things get a bit excitable.
Of course, he was Mr. Hitachi, who introduced Hitachi to the Sydney Hobart race.
That's correct.
I interrupt you. Keep going. Jervis Bay.
That's Jervis Bay anyway. But we probably overplayed our hand a little bit there. But one of the things I think that might have brought it to a head was that Sandy and I we were always a little bit mischievous with borrowing things for a little bit of a ride, and we found this big red fire engine out the back of the store.
This is on the naval base?
On the naval base, yes.
Sandy Schofield and you, yeah.
So it was a long way from there down to the jetty, and we had a lot of supplies for the trip back home. Copious cases of grog. And so we thought it'd be a good little trick to borrow the fire engine and load all these supplies on it and the crew.
What could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. And then so we took it for a bit of a trundle down to the wharf, and fortunately Sandy decided it'd be a good idea to put the siren on too while we were going down there. Now that caused no end of disturbance in the naval base. People were coming from all directions, and haven't got the time here to go into all the activities. But it was settled down by Spike Ross, another one of your interviews. He calmed things down a bit and let us escape. But they didn't.
That was the last race to Jervis Bay.
Last race to Jervis Bay, yes, yeah.
But as you said, you had a bit of an affinity to perhaps borrowing things. Tell us about the police launch in Hobart.
Oh, well, it was such a beautiful launch. You remember, is it? And Wazza and Sandy and I just happened to be walking past and was admiring the police launch, which everybody did. It was still down there, magnificent. And we decided to go on and give it a bit of a check out. And somebody said, I bet you couldn't start this. Well, no time at all. We had it started and decided we'd take it for a little bit of a cruise. And we just got the lines off when the sergeant come up from down below. He'd been having a bit of a nap, you know. Hello, boys, what's going on here? Going for a bit of a ride, are we? They were in the days, though, when people had a sense of humour, and we went out and had a bit of a ride and come back and tied it up and bought the man a beer later, and everything sort of settled down.
Yeah, today you'd still be in jail. yeah. Good stories. But then after Singapore, as you said, a lot of years up there, as I remember. And then...
Yeah, well, I used to only have my holidays every couple of years. So when I used to come back, I always got a ride for a Hobart. So instead of if I'd been living here, I probably would have been doing it Hobart every year, but I did Hobart every 2 years. So there was the Banjo Pattersons, and I did a 1971 on Churchill because of knowing the mob from Victorian days. Graham Warner was, and then I was back with Black Dog and Winger and Donnie Lang and Caldy again. Yeah, that's right, Caldy was.
Those well-known Victorian yachtsmen. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.